I'd like to welcome you to our Natural Habitat Adventures webinar today, Mountain Gorilla Encounters, presented by Mark Jordahl. And Mark is coming to you from our office in Boulder, Colorado. Let me tell you a little bit about Mark, and then we'll turn it over to him. Mark's love affair with Africa started in 2004 when he was midway through a master's program in conservation education and moved to Uganda. The move spurred him to shift his research focus to visitor experiences and conservation messaging. And he quickly realized Uganda is a hidden gem and threw his energy into helping more people experience the country's wonders. He's since led trips, served as a technical advisor to a USAID-funded sustainable tourism project, written guidebooks about 3 of Uganda's national parks for the Uganda Wildlife Authority, and explored the country from top to bottom. So that's a long way of saying you are here with an expert today. And so, Mark, we're delighted to be here with you, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Lee, and great to see so many people turning out for this webinar. I think this is a trip that's growing in popularity, and this is a part of the world that's starting to get on people's radar that, you know, really it is a bit of a hidden gem. A lot of people, it hasn't occurred to them yet to go there, but everybody who goes to Uganda and Rwanda is just blown away by it, and they start spreading the word. So I do think this is a trip that's going to continue to increase in popularity. The bulk of this presentation is going to be about the Uganda part of the trip, and then I'll touch on the Rwanda part towards the end. The reason for that is just that most of the Uganda section of this trip is the same, whether you're on the Great Uganda Gorilla Safari or if you're on the Ultimate Photo Trip. The Ultimate Photo Trip just has the Rwanda piece added on. So the bulk of this will be about Uganda. This quote from Ernest Hemingway I've always loved, because you have to remember this is a guy who was in 2 plane crashes in Uganda. And yet he still woke up happy every morning. There's just something about Africa that people tend to really connect deeply to it when they visit, and we have a lot of travelers who just keep coming back over and over again, doing multiple trips with us onto the continent. And each of those trips is different. Each country is very different, and you're never going to get bored. You're not going to run out of things to do in Africa. And this trip in particular is very different from what most people think about when they think of going on safari in Africa. It's very much a primate trip. It's forests, it's highlands, it's a diversity that you don't get in many places around Africa. So this really is a very unique experience within the world of Africa travel. I'd like to give people kind of a perspective on just how big Africa is, because most of us have grown up with the Mercator projection maps where Greenland looks about twice the size of Africa. But this image right here shows everything that would fit inside Africa. It's really an enormous continent, and that speaks to the diversity. If you go north to south, east to west, the cultures are incredibly different. The ecosystems are incredibly different. Again, you will not run out of things to do in Africa. You could go 5 times a year for the rest of your life, and there will always be new things to do, new places to experience. Uganda is just kind of right in the middle there. That lake that you see below it is Lake Victoria. And people have been trying to get to Uganda for a long time. A lot of the legendary explorers from the quest for the source of the Nile. You have on this screen David Livingstone on the left, Henry Morton Stanley on the right, and then in the center there is John Hanning Speke, who's credited with finally confirming that the source of the Nile was in Jinja on Lake Victoria in Uganda. And this isn't deep history. It feels when we hear these stories that it was so long ago, but my house here in Colorado was just built 15 years after Speke found the source of the Nile and 20 years before Uganda was even colonized. Henry Morton Stanley started his journalism career in a little town in the mountains about 30 miles from our offices here in Boulder. So really, the Western history and the visitation of Africa is fairly recent. Another well-known explorer who visited Uganda is Winston Churchill, and he really recognized that the natural beauty and the natural abundance in Uganda is just unmatched. Where it's located in the center of the country, you have the edge of the Congolese forest, you have the drier Sahel in the north, you have glacier-covered mountains, you have savanna, you have 20% of the country is wetlands and lakes. So there really is phenomenal diversity there. And this phrase, Uganda is truly the pearl of Africa, it's one that Ugandans are rightfully proud of, and you'll see it on tourism brochures. You'll be walking down the street and people will say, "Welcome to the Pearl of Africa." It's really, people are very proud of that phrase. In addition to the ecological diversity, it has incredible ethnic diversity as well. A recent Harvard study determined Uganda to be the #1 most ethnically diverse country on the planet. The way they determine that is if you pick 10 people at random from around the country and brought them to one place, there's a higher likelihood that more ethnicities would be represented in that group than in any other country in the world. Uganda is about the size of Oregon, and there are over 40 recognized languages and 4 different language families within that. So imagine going to Portland and realizing that you didn't speak the same language as somebody who lived in Ashland. And by language families, it's from northern Uganda in those Nilotic languages to the Bantu languages in the south. It's like German and Chinese, completely different languages. Most of the Bantu languages can communicate, most of the Nilotic ones can, but there's almost no crossover in language. This trip takes place in the Bantu language group areas. But again, it's incredibly diverse ethnically, and even though I'm sure you're going thinking that you're in it for the gorillas and in it for the wildlife, you'll very likely find that it's the people that you take back with you. After about 15 years on and off of living in Uganda, I can very honestly say that the friendliest, most welcoming, warm people I've ever met in the world are Ugandans, and just hardworking, just ambitious, and so welcoming. They're just so happy to have people coming to visit, and there's so much pride in the country that people love to show it off. So it's really fun to be a visitor there. Now we'll focus a little bit on the actual trip itself. You see right in the middle there in Entebbe Airport, that's where we fly in and begin the trip. And those national parks out to the west is where most of the trip takes place. And there's a reason for that. It's an incredibly active area geologically. A lot of us grew up hearing about the Great Rift Valley. Now geologists talk about the East African Rift System. It's actually a series of faults and rifts that stretch from the Red Sea all the way down to Mozambique. And our trip is in that, what you see on the far left, the Western Rift Valley. It's also known as the Albertine Rift. And this movement has had a lot to do with why Uganda is so diverse. The way rifts form is basically plates move away from each other, the land in between drops down, and then it gets filled up with sediment. So the area that we're going to be traveling through, some of the time we'll be driving on 4,000 kilometers of sediment. And if you look at this satellite image of Uganda, that big lake kind of in the center is Lake Victoria, and kind of to the upper left of that are the lakes that we will be traveling along. And if you notice that green forest, that's the Congolese forest that comes right up to the uplands that were caused by the rifting process. And that's a lot of why there's so much diversity. You have some of the most biologically rich forests in the world, and the largest, coming right up to this edge. The Ruwenzori Mountains are along there, which are glacier-covered mountains. They're the legendary mountains of the moon that were predicted by Ptolemy, a Greek geographer, a couple thousand years ago. He predicted that there had to be glacier-covered mountains on the equator feeding the Nile, and nobody believed him, but sure enough, the Ruwenzori's are there. And that edge of uplift blocks all that moisture from the west and gives us the savannas to the east, which all of East Africa is so well known for. So again, we'll get back to our trip here. We fly into Entebbe Airport, and you'll quickly get swept away to the Protea Hotel in Entebbe. Great place to start the trip. You can imagine as you're recovering from a long flight, it's pretty nice to be able to spend your first morning relaxing there, overlooking Lake Victoria. Our hotel's just a few minutes from the airport, so it's nice and quick. And then the next day, we have the opportunity to visit the Entebbe Botanical Gardens. This is if you come in before 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the first day. And most flights come into Uganda late at night, so most people do arrive the night before the beginning of the trip, partly just to have time to recover, but partly to make sure you're there in time for the Botanical Gardens. This is the place where the original Tarzan movie jungle scenes were filmed with Johnny Weissmuller. So it's a great place to stretch your legs after the long flight and start to see some of the great bird life, black and white casqued hornbill here, black and white colobus. So we start seeing some of the primates right away. And it's just a really nice, relaxing way to spend that first day. And then we go back to the Protea for our orientation and for our first dinner together. The next morning, we hop into our safari vehicles and we head out to get out to the west where those national parks are. That first day's drive is it's a good long one. It's a good 6 hours on a pretty decent highway, and even though it's kind of a long drive, it's a great opportunity to see some of the village life. We go through a lot of towns and villages. We will stop for lunch along the roadside one day, and it never takes long to draw a crowd and have the opportunity to start interacting, definitely with kids. We often bring some soccer balls with us to have some fun while we're stopped there. But again, the drive is a great opportunity to really get a sense of life in Uganda. And one of my favorite things about this trip is there's a lot more cultural interaction on this trip than there are on some other safaris. Uganda, again, is a very small country. It has a pretty dense population, and conservation and human communities are so closely intertwined in Uganda that the stories can't be told one without the other. And it's a great trip, and that you really do get to meet people in the communities and see how they are interacting with the parks, how the presence of the parks affects them, and how they really, it's our visitation, it's tourism that helps incentivize the communities around the parks to protect the wildlife, because we're bringing a lot of money into these communities through staying at the lodges, through park entrance fees, which are shared with the local communities. So it really is a trip that weaves the human and the wild together incredibly well. The long drive is definitely worth it. We arrive at Indali Lodge, which is just a beautiful little boutique lodge run by a husband and wife couple, third generation of being on this land. And it's just a wonderful place to stay, incredible food. You feel like you're part of the family almost immediately upon arrival. And if you see this Crater Lake here, the red arrow right there is pointing to Indali Lodge. And that first afternoon when we arrive, weather and time permitting, there's about an hour-and-a-half walk around this Crater Lake with lots of birds and monkeys. And also they have some great guides who kind of tell us about the cultural history of the area. So it's, again, a really nice chance to stretch our legs after the drive and also start getting that taste of wildlife. And it's just a beautiful Crater Lake to walk around. There's a school on the property of the lodge, which again, time permitting, we like to make a stop there and meet the kids. And this building here is a reading room that Natural Habitat Adventures funded through our philanthropy program that is funded through gear sales, through our gear store. So this was under construction when I was just there in June. I would imagine it's probably about finished by now. And actually a traveler on one of our recent trips offered to donate the books for the reading room. So it's great coming into a community where we really feel like we've contributed. The next morning, we head to Kibale National Park. We start the morning just on the outskirts of the park at the Mahogany Wetlands Community Tourism Project. A beautiful place, about 100 or more species of birds there, a number of primate species, but possibly most importantly, it's just a perfect example of community tourism and what we're all about. It's a community that had this small swamp that's completely surrounded by farmlands. The monkeys that were living in the wetland kept going out and raiding the crops, and the communities were really frustrated by this and wanted to clear the swamp, fill it, and get rid of the monkeys so they wouldn't have to keep battling to protect their crops. Some of the community members saw the value of having this wetland here and developed this tourism project that is now bringing in incredible amounts of money into this community. It's helping to fund the school, it's funding scholarships for the older students to go to college, it's training young people to become tour guides, which is a great industry to be in Uganda. And they also pay to have people guard the crops against the monkeys, so the monkeys won't raid and take the food away. So it's really, it's everything that tourism should be. So it's a great way to start this time in the forest. After the walk, we go have a local food meal at Tinka's homestead. The food in Uganda is amazing. It's all so fresh. Most of the ingredients that we have for this lunch come right out of Tinka's garden. So it's a good chance to try some incredible fresh food. Then in the afternoon, we head out to see these guys. We do our first chimpanzee trek that afternoon. We do 2 treks, one in the afternoon and one the next morning, just to see the different activities. You know, so you never know quite what you're gonna see. Sometimes you get these incredible moments where they're down low and you feel like they're posing for you, and you just have a great opportunity to spend time with the chimps. Sometimes we get this, where you're craning your neck back and we're all ready for massages at the end of the evening. There are about 1,500 chimps in this forest. It also has about 13 total primate species. So it has one of the richest diversities of primate species in the world of any forest. And there are about 1,500 chimps, so the highest population of chimps in any remaining forest. And the family that's been habituated for tourism has about 130 members. The way chimps live, they don't all hang out together in that group of 130. They break into smaller groups and move throughout the forest to feed. So, you know, you might end up getting just a few that you're spending your hour with. Sometimes you'll get 20 or 30. Sometimes they're more active, sometimes they're less active. So having the 2 chimp treks gives us twice as many chances to get some interesting interactions. And just a couple other examples of monkeys that we're likely to see there. The red-tailed monkeys, which are incredibly playful, constantly just leaping through the trees. They're definitely amazing acrobats. Gray-cheeked mangabees, which I always think they look a little bit like the Grinch, except they're not green. And then the next day, so the second day we do the morning chimp trek, and then that afternoon we drive down to Queen Elizabeth National Park. We will cross the equator on the way down, and we'll definitely do the obligatory photo opportunity at the equator, and then continue down to what's called the Moya Peninsula. And this picture, don't worry about the colors. It doesn't mean it's toxic. I like this image because it really shows that center area that has what looks like a river going through it. That's called the Kazinga Channel. And then that very flat ground on either side of the channel, that is the bottom of the Rift Valley. So that's that area that's been filled with sediment. It's very smooth. And then those areas on the sides of it, you can see all those craters that were formed by the rifting process. When the plates pull apart, it leaves very thin parts of the crust, and the magma just explodes out of there. It's a very unique geological area. There are very few places like this in the world where this volcanic activity did not create volcanic cones. It's these blast craters. And there are 70 or 80 of these blast craters creating a dramatic landscape. But I definitely think one of the most fascinating things about Queen Elizabeth National Park really is the geology around the location. And then that arrow down there is the Moya Peninsula. And that's where we spend our next couple nights at the Moya Safari Lodge overlooking the channel. Just a really beautiful spot. They're often just right across the water there. You'll see buffalo, elephants. Occasionally elephants actually come right up to the lodge. So it's a pretty fun place to be. Example of one of those blast craters. And there you're seeing the eastern escarpment of the rift across the way. And the Ruwenzori Mountains, again, just stunning, stunning landscapes. If you've been on safari in Botswana or Kruger National Park or Serengeti, the numbers of wildlife here are not the same. This is definitely, it's a primate safari, and this savanna experience is kind of a bonus. We're here and there are opportunities to see some great stuff, but Uganda has a difficult history with its wildlife. Back in the 70s and 80s, under Amin and Obote, about 85% of the wildlife was wiped out from Uganda. And fortunately, since the mid-80s, the country's been incredibly stable, incredibly safe, and they've done a really good job protecting their parks. So poaching's been much lower than in a lot of parts of the continent, and the wildlife numbers are just rebounding incredibly. So we definitely do have the opportunity to see some great wildlife. Some buffalo. This is the Uganda cob, the national antelope. So we do a few game drives to see some of the great savanna species that are out there. And possibly one of the biggest highlights of the time in Queen Elizabeth is the boat ride on the Kazinga Channel, where we'll see wildlife along the shore. Definitely a lot of hippos. Has one of the highest concentrations of hippos anywhere in Africa. Crocodiles along the shoreline. Incredible bird life, African fish eagle, black-crowned heron, malachite kingfisher. Queen Elizabeth has over 600 species of birds, which is one of the highest concentrations of bird species of any protected area in the world. And again, the human history and the wildlife history are deeply intertwined in Uganda. So while you're on the trip, there will, I'm sure, be a lot of discussion about there are 11 human communities that have been grandfathered in within the boundaries of the parks. There are fishing communities, there are communities that gather salt from the crater lakes, and it's definitely a sometimes challenging dynamic for being a community that's surrounded by an area rich in predators, and it can be difficult sometimes for the wildlife to be so close to human communities. So it's definitely those conversations are important to have on this trip about the relationship between the people and the parks. After we leave Moya Safari Lodge, we head down to the Ishasha sector and stay at the Ishasha Wilderness Camp, which is one of my favorite places, right on the Ntungwe River here. It feels so remote and wild. Queen Elizabeth National Park is the most visited park in Uganda, but this Ishasha sector is very few people ever make their way down here, which is one of the reasons that we love to get there, because you really do feel like you're just out in an incredibly wild environment. This is the view out from the cabins at this lodge. The landscape's just stunning. Some topi here, water buck, so great antelope species. Often some good elephant sightings. This section of the park is right on the border of Congo, so you get a lot of elephants who are crossing over from the Congo side and escaping the poaching that's going on over there to the much safer lands on the Uganda side of the border. And then the tree climbing lions is really one of our main goals during this part of the trip. There are only a couple places in Africa that are really known for tree climbing lions, and Ishasha is one of those. And nobody really knows exactly why they go up into the trees. It gets them to cooler breezes, it gets them away from the bugs that are near the ground. But really, most people think it's because these huge fig trees exist, and that if trees like this existed in more savanna areas, more lions would take up the habit of climbing trees. You never know if you're going to see them. We always hope we will, but there are about 15 trees in the Ishasha sector that the lions like to frequent during the day, and if they have crossed over to the Congo side of the border, we can't follow them over there. So we just hope that we will see them in one of these trees. But as with most wildlife sightings, you never know. But this was last August. I got this picture, so they're definitely a highlight when we do find them. Then it's time to head down towards the gorillas, down to Windy Impenetrable National Park, and to our lodge at Mahogany Springs, which is just a few minutes from the park entrance, which is really nice as we get up to go on our gorilla safaris to be so close. Time and weather permitting, once we get down to Bahoma, the town where Mahogany Springs Lodge is, we like to visit this coffee plantation. It's called Conservation Coffee, and it was funded by our partners at WWF. And it's a way to incentivize communities to help protect the wildlife in the area. Coffee and tea are great buffer crops between a park and a community, because for some reason, gorillas haven't yet figured out that coffee is a great way to start your day. So they get out there, they come across coffee crops, and they turn back into the forest because they feel like there's nothing there for them to eat. So farmers in this area have been incentivized or encouraged to plant coffee and tea, and then this organization, the Conservation Through Public Health, in partnership with WWF, buys the coffee from them, sells it, and then reinvests that money into the community. So it's a great way that by us going and visiting, we're also putting money into that community. You may get a chance to grind the coffee beans here. And they also give us some examples of the community education they're doing in the area, because one of the biggest conservation challenges with the gorillas and chimpanzees is that we're so closely related to them that human diseases can transfer over to the gorillas. So really focusing on human health in these communities is incredibly important for protecting the health of the gorillas. And the next morning we go out on our first trek, and everybody's biggest question is always, what is the trek gonna be like? And it's incredibly difficult to answer that. It can be very challenging. You can see here that there's very variable terrain that you will be hiking on. You could be out hiking for 4 or 5 hours in pouring rain to get to the gorillas over difficult trails. In June, my group and I broke certainly my personal record when we got to the gorillas in 14 minutes. So there's a pretty big range of what the hike can be like. No matter what the hike's gonna be like, these folks here are your best friends. These are the porters, and they're there to help you make it to the gorillas. They'll be carrying the stuff that you're bringing, your lunch, your water, your jackets, your camera for the day. And in addition to that, they will literally hold you and help you up the hill. You can put an arm around them. If you have any concerns at all about your physical abilities to do this trip, the porters just make it so much easier for us. And every person on the trip has a porter included in their trip fee, so everybody will have one. But if you have any concerns, for about $20 more, you can hire an additional porter. And not only does that make your life and your experience so much easier, but again, it's putting money into the communities. The porters don't get paid if they don't work. So the more of them get hired per day, the more money is going into those communities, the more incentive they have to make sure that the gorillas are protected, because that's why we're coming. Regardless of the gorillas, just being in the forest is an amazing experience. It's beautiful, it's primordial. In the warming and the drying and wet cycles throughout the last few million years in Africa, this area was a refugium where it never dried out. So these forests are truly ancient, and it's a big part of why they are so biologically diverse. So you're hiking through the forest, just learning so much from the guides who are out there with us, and then you start to see the signs. This is a nest of one of the gorillas. One of the great things about gorillas is there's about a 99% chance that we will see them on any given hike, because there are trackers who follow them until they bed down each night, and then the next morning they go back out, find those beds, and then track them from there. And then they're communicating with our guide to let us know where the gorillas are. So it's, like I said, 99% chance of seeing them. And you're not just wandering around aimlessly trying to find the gorillas. We actually have people out there who have located them, and they're directing our guide to bring us to the gorillas. Then you look through the foliage and you start to see these incredible animals. And you really do get this close. You know, people are always amazed that you can have this intimate an encounter with a wild animal. You know, there are no barriers on this trip. You're not in a vehicle looking out through the window. You're definitely not in a zoo. You are right out there with the mountain gorillas. And for me, they're so close to us in so many ways that sitting down with them and spending the hour with them, I can really imagine myself living in the forest. The ways they interact, their gentleness, their playfulness. There are always a wide variety of ages, and the kids are just like human kids, spinning around a tree, climbing up, piling on top of mom. They're incredibly affectionate towards each other. Even the silverbacks are very much involved in the raising of the young. So just a very affectionate experience, and you can just imagine we're just not that different from them. This is what the boundary of the park looks like. This is one of the highest populated areas of anywhere in Africa. And you can see that agriculture has come right up to the boundary of the park. And I can almost absolutely say that if it wasn't for gorilla tourism, gorillas would no longer exist. There would continue to be more and more pressure to convert this forest to agriculture if in the 1960s, a couple of Dian Fossey's graduate students hadn't gone to the Rwandan government and said, you can actually make money off bringing people to see these gorillas. And just when the Virunga National Park in Rwanda was about to be converted to farmland, they convinced the Rwandan government to halt that project and protect that area for gorillas and to start bringing tourists to see them. And that quickly spread over to Uganda and Rwanda as well, the only 3 countries that have mountain gorillas. And it really is people like us coming to visit these gorillas and putting money into these communities and into the park system that has kept these animals alive. The forests, in addition to agriculture, a lot of them are being cut for firewood. This is charcoal that still in Uganda, about 93% of people cook over wood or charcoal. So it really, it's important that there are strong incentives to protect these forests. Mountain gorillas are the only great ape species whose population is increasing. So there's a lot of really good news with gorilla conservation. These numbers are already outdated. They just finished a census in Rwanda that has shown that the overall international gorilla population is over 1,000 now. And we should know sometime in the next few months, or definitely by the end of the year, what the numbers are in Uganda. But I think we can definitely expect this number to be 1,100 or 1,200 by the time the census is finished. So it really is working. Our partners at WWF and International Gorilla Conservation Program have done a lot of work to make sure that this border isn't getting pushed higher up these mountains. And a lot of really good work is happening, and they are being protected. You can see here on this image, Bwindi Impenetrable National Park, which is where we visit the gorillas on the Uganda program, down to where you visit them if you're doing the photo trip and adding in the Rwanda part. It's only about 27 miles apart, but you can see it's been completely altered and changed to agriculture. So there's no corridor for the gorillas to travel between these two pieces of forest. And it's even been divided long enough that some scientists are considering whether they should be considered two different subspecies just because they've been separated for so long. But for now, we get to have this amazing experience with them and really know that by visiting the gorillas, we are absolutely directly contributing to their conservation. If you're doing the Uganda trip, after our second, again, just like with the chimpanzees, we do 2 gorilla treks, visiting 2 different families, just making sure that we have increased chances to see a variety. Each, again, gorillas are so closely related to us that each family, each silverback has a distinct personality. And you'll see different behaviors by visiting 2 different family groups. So the Uganda trip, at this point, you fly back to Entebbe for departure. We all have day rooms back at the Protea Hotel. Again, most of the flights leave late at night, so have some time to relax and clean up at the hotel before going to the airport. I'm going to kind of go a little quickly. I want to make sure there's a little time for questions here. If you're on the photo trip, you'll continue down to Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda. Just about a 4 or 5 hour drive with a little bit of time at the border to take care of visas and get across. Stay at 5 Volcanoes Lodge, again, very, very close to the park headquarters, an easy 15-minute drive or so to get to your gorilla trekking, where you do 2 additional treks in Rwanda if you're on the photo trip. The terrain is very different. The gorillas here are living up on these volcanoes, whereas in Uganda, it's much more of an undulating going up and through ravines. In Rwanda, it's more going gradually up the sides of these volcanoes. And again, we have two more opportunities to spend time with the gorillas. The forests are very different than in Uganda. They're a little bit more open. You have these incredible African redwood trees. So it is definitely a different experience trekking the gorillas in the 2 different countries. The Rwanda part of the trip also includes a visit to the golden monkeys, which is very fun. You'll be in a troop of 40 or 50 of them jumping in the trees all around you. For the photographers, both for the gorillas and the golden monkeys, if possible, it's great to bring 2 camera bodies so that you're not constantly switching between a telephoto and a wide angle. This lens might be a little bit overkill for this shot. So, you really do have some very close encounters where you probably don't need your telephoto, but then you want to be prepared for those times when they are up in the trees or a little farther away and you want to have that telephoto. After the 2 treks for the gorillas there, you return to Kigali for departing flights and also a visit to the Genocide Memorial Museum, which is a very powerful and well curated memorial to the events in 1994. And that is the end of these trips. And I thank you again for joining. It looks like we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I'd love to open it up. And really, I believe that this is such a unique trip, such a unique experience. There aren't many places in the world, there aren't many species you can visit in the world where you can have such an incredible, close, intimate encounter with wildlife, and also really interweave that experience with visiting communities and learning about the relationship between people and the parks. So I hope you all choose to come on one of our gorilla trips someday.
Thank you so much. What a great presentation. I think we're all inspired to go on a gorilla trip for sure. And one of our top questions today was about group size. So what is the overall, the average group size, and then how many will go out in a trek together?
Great. The Uganda trip has a maximum of 11, and the photo trip has a maximum of 9, just to have a little more space for camera equipment and a little more time for one-on-one photography lessons with the expedition leader. So yeah, and most of these trips do either fill or come very close to filling. It's not very often that we have less than a maximum number on these trips. The gorilla treks, you have a maximum of 8 people in a group. So our group of 11 will be divided into 2 different groups. If the groupings are the same from one day to the next, the expedition leader will go with one group one day, the other group the other day. But with the park staff, you have the park guide with you, in addition to the porters, who are all resources for what you're seeing. These park guides know every gorilla by name, when they were born, who their parents are. It's really amazing. So even if you're in the group without the expedition leader, you have an incredible resource there for learning about the gorillas. And often what we try to do, it's never a guarantee, but we do tend to get a wide range of physical abilities on these trips. And often they will know, the park staff will know in the morning which families of gorillas will be easier or more difficult to get to, just based on where they slept the night before. And that can change, but we're often able to say, okay, you know, these 4 people from our group would rather have an easy hike today. These 5 are really ready to push it, and we can get those who want an easier hike onto one of those easier families, and those who want a more challenging hike onto a more challenging group. It doesn't always work out, but that's always our goal, and usually we're able to make something like that happen.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you so much. So this next question is a really big question. I think it's going to cover a lot of the other questions that we've gotten. But the question is about best time to visit, and then underneath that, things like, you know, rain or, you know, wildlife viewing and insects and everything that goes along with choosing the best time to come visit. Right.
So these are rainforests, and that is a question that comes up a lot. And honestly, there are rainier seasons and drier seasons. With climate change, that's all up in the air. It's not consistent anymore. And in the dry season, in these forests, you're gonna get rain. And in the rainy season, you could possibly get sunshine. But really, for the time trekking the chimps and the time trekking the gorillas, you should be prepared for rain. Your expedition leader, each of those mornings, even if you start out your day in the sun, they're probably going to recommend that you bring rain gear with you, jacket and pants, and very waterproof, not just water resistant, because we can get a lot of rain. These forests are big enough that they create their own weather patterns. So even if you're, if 20 miles away, it could be hot and sunny, you could still get rained on in these forests. So you definitely want to be prepared for that. The areas that we travel to are comfortable year round. Uganda really has a pretty stable and perfect climate. It's usually, you know, most of the days will hover right around 80. 80 degrees. It'll get a little chilly at night when we're up in the higher country, especially up in Bahoma when we're doing the gorilla trekking, or down in Rwanda when you're doing the gorilla trekking. So you definitely want to have a light fleece along because the evenings can get cool. And even in the afternoon, if it gets rainy and windy, it can get cool. Bugs, everybody is usually incredibly relieved and happy to get there and find that bugs really aren't a big deal in Uganda. There are mosquitoes, and I'll talk a little bit about malaria in a sec, but if you've ever been to Minnesota, that's 20 times worse in the summer than anywhere you could go in Uganda. It's really, bugs are not a big deal. They're not a big issue. It is recommended to take malaria prophylaxis anytime you come to visit Uganda. Mostly that's for just the section in the middle when you're at Queen Elizabeth National Park, because it is a little lower, a little bit warmer. Malaria does exist there. It's not a terribly high risk, but given that you're there for just a couple weeks, there's no reason to take the chance. I would go ahead and take the meds. Talk to there are travel medical clinics at most hospitals, county health centers, and just find out the recommendations from them. Different medications might have different interactions with other medications that you're on, but it's definitely recommended to be on a malaria prophylaxis for this trip, even though you might go the whole trip and not get a single mosquito bite.
Okay, good advice. Thank you for covering that. Another very popular question is the age range for your visitors on both ends. We're wondering what the youngest age that you would take gorilla trekking, and then also what about older travelers, fit 80-year-olds?
Right. Yeah. So you have to be 15 to trek the gorillas. So that's sort of the bottom end for this trip. The top end, on a trip a couple of years ago, I had an 82-year-old who was the fastest person in our entire group. So it definitely, I feel like your personal fitness level is a more important indicator than your age. One thing I will say is you're at a higher elevation. You're at 5,000–6,000 feet in Uganda, 7,000–8,000 feet in Rwanda, possibly even up to 9,000 or 10,000 feet. So a lot of times people say, well, I started going out walking a mile every evening at my home in Louisiana, but this is harder than I was expecting. It can be a very challenging hike. So fitness level is important. I would say most of our travelers are in kind of 50 to 85 range, I think is a safe range to say. And again, even if you're not incredibly physically fit, the porters are such an incredible help. I've literally had people put an arm around each of two porters and not get completely carried up, but supported and able to hike on the slippery stuff. And really, they said afterwards, I couldn't have done it without the porters. So, just taking that extra $20 and hiring a second porter can sometimes really make the difference on your experience of the trip.
All right. Well, thank you. That's so good to know. And so talking about the interaction with the gorillas, do they actually interact with the group? And if so, what sort of guidelines or instruction are given to your travelers?
Yeah, that's a great question. The young ones in particular often really will interact with you. We are not allowed to approach the gorillas within 21 feet, 7 meters. So we can't go towards them within that distance. However, if we are staying put and they come towards us, that it is okay. We don't necessarily have to back off. If you're at all sick, have a cold, anything like that, you will not be allowed on the hike. Just like I said, if we're so closely related that those germs can transmit and we can actually give diseases to the gorillas, and how horrible would we feel if we did that? But on my trip in June, we actually had a couple of young ones that kept running up and trying to grab our pant legs. So they really will come walking, had a big blackback, just walk right by and brush my legs. So they find us often as fascinating as we find them. There are instances where sometimes the silverbacks will do kind of a bluff charge where they'll make a lot of noise and pound their chest just like they do in the movies, and kind of run towards you and then break it off 8 or 10 feet away from you. It really gets your heart racing, but again, the ranger is there with you, and they give you instructions beforehand. You basically you stand your ground, but you look kind of off to the side and towards the ground. You maybe crouch down a little bit just so that you look submissive. But that can be a very exciting encounter when that happens. Again, very safe. It's bluff charges. These are habituated family groups. So there aren't aggressive, actual interactions at all. It's just them making sure that they're the boss. And you really are interacting with the animals while you're there.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being with us today. We just have had tons of questions, and anything that we still got 61 unanswered questions.
Oh,
so, wow, right? And a lot of them were some that we've already covered, but still just lots of great interest, and anything unanswered, we'll make sure to review and get one of our adventure specialists to get back in touch with an answer on that. So let me turn it back over to you now, Mark, for your closing comments.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I hope I kind of got across just the idea that this part of the world is amazing. Not that many people have been there. It's starting to increase in popularity. So I'd say go now. It's an incredible experience. And once you do decide to do this trip and go on it, I really hope you spread the word, because this is, there are parts of the world that have too much tourism, and this is not one of those parts of the world. Uganda, Rwanda really rely on visitors to come, and that's what's driving the conservation of species like the mountain gorillas, and it's why they've been so successful so far with protecting elephants and other species. So it's a trip you can really feel good about taking, because you're contributing to the conservation of the animals that you're traveling to see. So I really hope to see you out there sometime.
And my thanks as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be making sure that all of you have a link to the replay. So we'll get that out to all of you. And again, thank you all for being with us. And with that, we'll say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.